Welcome, friends of the Crawford Art Gallery, to the Autumn Lecture Series. And this is the point of the day where I'd usually say to you to check your mobile phones, switch them off, and that the emergency exits are behind me to my left and to my right. But it's different this time. So instead I'm going to say to you, throw on the kettle, put up your feet, and join Matthew Whyte inside in the long room for the Statio Bene.
A very warm welcome to the friends of the Crawford Art Gallery. I'm Matthew Whyte and we're here again for today's talk in the long room, and we're going to take a journey today just behind me into the Penrose rooms, which you'll all be familiar with. We're going to continue thinking about Cork's port. We're going to continue thinking about the maritime tradition of our city, and we're going to take a look at one painting which you'll probably have seen before, a View of Cork from Audley Place by John Butts. And we're going to use it to think about not only how we can visualise Cork back in the time in which this painting was made, but also how this painting illustrates and plays into Cork's overseas trade, its drawing from the cultures with which it was in contact back in the 18th century. So I hope you can sit back and enjoy this morning's talk. We've taken a step inside here to the Penrose room, of course, which you'll all be familiar with from having been in the gallery so many times. I'm going to talk a little bit about Cork again. We're focusing in on Cork's history, so we're really moving on from the previous video that you would have seen in this series as such, where we're thinking about Cork and we're thinking about Cork's visual culture as part of a wider European context. And as I said in the lecture that you would have seen previous, it's always nice to think about Cork, our city, and the art that we produced, not just as something that was sort of homogenous to the city itself, but something that actually played a role and something that took and contributed to a much wider tradition that took place, of course, all around Europe. And so I like to always think about these Irish artists, and I like to think about these Cork images as being part of a wider artistic tradition. And it's always fun and it's always interesting to try to tease out exactly how those traditions were drawn upon by these various artists. So here we're looking at a very well-known image, and you're all going to be familiar with this one. But I want to think about it, even though we've taken just a couple of steps in from Statio Bene, where we were looking at Cork's maritime history. I want to think about this in a sort of a similar vein, as something which forms a kind of a part or an extension of that exhibition that we were looking at. This idea of Cork's port and its maritime tradition as being an inextricable part of the city's identity. We've gone a little bit earlier here. We were looking in the previous talk at images that were made around the year 1850. Well, we've gone 100 years earlier here. This is John Butts' View of Cork from Audley Place from 1750. And so we've taken a step backwards in time. We've taken a step away from vigorous industrialization. We've taken a step away from romanticism, and we're looking at an entirely different tradition, an entirely different genre of painting here. But what we can also think about in the context of this image is still how Cork and how Cork's art sat within an existing tradition and defined itself alongside that existing tradition. It's one of the fascinating things about Irish art more generally, not just art that's situated in Cork. It's that Ireland really formed its visual tradition alongside the bigger movements that were taking place across Europe. Irish art really began to emerge prominently around the 17th century and kind of blew up from there. So you'll see artists who travelled, who came back, brought influences with them, or artists who were influenced by people who travelled over here. And of course, nowhere is this more true than in Cork, where we have this maritime tradition. We have this very vigorous, very lively exchange with different geographic centres, different nations, and of course different cultures. And it's always going to be reflected in the art. Art is nothing if not a kind of a manifestation of the culture that produced it. And so let's have a look at this painting in a way which takes those questions as the centre of our line of inquiry. This is such a well-known artwork. It's one of the most loved artworks in the gallery because, of course, it's so bound to Cork's identity. We're looking at the city. We're actually taking a perspective on the city that so many of us are very familiar with. When you walk up Patrick's Hill, if you were brave enough to do so, because it's such a difficult walk, and you reach the top. Today you've got a lovely park setting where you can sit on a bench, which would be maybe situated just a little bit over here, and you can take this perspective. You can see Shandon, you can see the city, you can watch the sun set over in the west just over here, and you can enjoy a kind of a bit of quiet time. Well, this is also what the artist is doing here. Audley Place is the perfect vantage point from which to get a really nice vista of the city, and that's what the artist is doing here. Now, as I say, I want to look at this in a more complex way than just viewing it as an image of Cork itself, but it's also nice to do that because most of us are Cork people, I presume, who are watching this video. I'm certainly a Cork person myself. And we can take this image and we can pick out what's familiar to us. Of course, what strikes us most prominently is the Crawford Art Gallery, which is situated just here, almost in the centre of the painting. It's in the centre of the painting here, not because it's important as an art gallery at this point in time, but because it's important as an economic hub for the city. This building, as you'll probably all be aware, was built in 1724, so it's just entering into its 26th year when this painting was made. It was built, of course, as the customs house of the city, not as the art gallery. And it was the customs house for almost a century before it became the art gallery. And so what we're seeing here is actually the customs house. And the way that John Butts has represented it reflects that use. Very interesting. You can see that Emmet Place, where we would be standing if we were to look at the side of the Crawford Art Gallery, is water. It's where boats can sail in and out. Of course, it was essential to have access to the art gallery, to the customs house in that way for boats so that they wouldn't block up the river. There's this open space outside the front where goods can be offloaded and taken onto the ships. Of course, today that's taken up by the Opera House. So it's lovely to see the changing land uses that took place in the city. Parts of the river that were reclaimed to land. Now today, of course, we have one of the city's only open kind of piazzas or squares. You can see St. Patrick's Street. You would see St. Patrick's Bridge here, but of course here you have the opening of a smaller river. St. Patrick's Street used to be that river which loops in behind all of these buildings. Again, something that was reclaimed from the river. You can see very prominent buildings, of course, Shandon, sitting up above the town, the Goldie Fish that Cork is famous for, under the Goldie Fish. And you have St. Finbarr's Cathedral. Almost unrecognisable because it hasn't received its 19th century renovation in the French Gothic style by William Burgess just yet, not for about another 110 years, I think, after this painting is made. But quite aside from the fact that this is, a nice painting for us to look at because we can admire some of the buildings that we're familiar with, we can admire the city we're familiar with, it also plays into the kind of undercurrent of Cork culture in a different way. If we look, of course, something that allows us to see all these buildings is the extremely fine, intricate level of detail that is in this painting. What we can also see is a waterline or a waterfront here that is maybe not as familiar to us today. The Crawford Art Gallery today stands out from the rest of the city, specifically because of its distinct architectural style. It's built in the Dutch style of architecture. If you've been to Amsterdam, which I'm sure probably all of you have, you'd be very familiar with this red brick style of architecture. It's derived from Dutch influence, namely because it was a Dutch architect who built this, a man named Luyventon. What you can see all along the waterfront here is that Dutch style of architecture really dominated in the city during the early 18th century. This would also have been true for cities like New York. The reason being is Cork, at this point in time, was an extremely successful economic merchant hub because of its trade links with places like, in this case, the Dutch Republic. And so it's really interesting, I think, to see that the appearance of Cork City matches its cultural links with other nations. It's defined by its cultural links with other nations. And this is what's so valuable about this painting, apart from just something that we can all identify with, because most of us, live here or around here. it also shows us such an important part of Cork's history. Cork is a successful city because it was a successful city. And of course, this links back to the lecture that you would have seen previous, where we were looking at images from Statio Bene. This ties into Cork's maritime tradition. What's accentuated here is the basin that comes down from the north side and highlights this island that is our city centre, that's dominated by Cork's port. And not only topographically or geographically, as you can see also aesthetically and architecturally, Cork is defined by the function of its harbour to make overseas links possible. Now, quite aside from looking at the look of Cork City itself, let's take a step back and kind of think about the painting itself. We know that it's depicting Cork, but more generally, what is the painting depicting? Well, it's a landscape. It's a fairly panoramic landscape, as you can see. Now, of course, these things we often take for granted today, this idea of a landscape painting, a painting of a seascape, a painting of a portrait, a painting of a biblical narrative, all of these things we really take for granted. However, landscape painting didn't always exist. Of course, you always had landscapes in paintings. You would, maybe images of the Madonna and Child, you might have had images of, Adam and Eve, Dido and Aeneas, and they'd be in this kind of Arcadian landscape that's in the background. But really the focus and the most important aspect of the painting were the figures, the human figures who would be in the foreground. Well, beginning in the 17th century, people began to take lesser importance within the landscape. When this took place, the landscape conversely began to take precedence over the humans within it. This happened in the Dutch Republic first. And landscape painting, as we know it today, is really owed to a movement which took place after 1648 in the Dutch Republic, where the Dutch Republic was actually formed, that watershed moment in 1648, where Dutch painting changed from something that was almost entirely religious or genre-based into something that focused on a very accurate representation of the Dutch landscape. And why did that happen? Well, in 1648, as I say, the Republic was formed. The Dutch people, and the Dutch Republic more generally, became very aware of the fact that theirs was a successful trading centre. Their city was allowed to prosper because of its topography, because of these systems of canals and waterways. And so they felt almost like they were God's chosen people. They were given this landscape through a series of floods in the 16th century, which might have devastated another country, but which actually gave them the means by which they could prosper. And so they felt a very deep urge and a need to record their landscape, to show it in both an idealistic way, but also in a realistic way. It was a duty of theirs. And so this form of landscape painting, just as much as the look of Cork City itself is derived from its Dutch influences, the actual painting of this Cork artist is also derived from Dutch influence. So you can really see the importation of different cultures into Cork's own culture itself. A panoramic landscape which is extremely detailed. You can see almost every individual chimney stack. This was such a crucial aspect of Dutch landscape painting because it had to be accurate. It had to show the landscape as it was. And so as you can see here, John Butts is drawing on that tradition very, very prominently, very deliberately as well. You can see these two figures in the foreground. You might wonder why they're there. They're just enjoying the landscape, as one would be in this point in time. But why did the artist put them there? Some people say, well, maybe it's the artist himself. Not quite. The artist very deliberately places us within the painting. He doesn't, as some artists often do, take an elevated perspective, as if we're kind of floating above the landscape. No, he puts us in a very specific point, which makes the landscape more realistic. These figures are there, on the one hand, to be identified with. This is something that will be developed much more in Romanticism, incidentally, as we were discussing in the previous lecture, as a kind of a spiritual intercessor for the person looking at the painting. But here it's more of a pragmatic reason. They're there to show us where we would be standing if we were looking at this landscape. But they're also there for scale. Because in the Dutch tradition, these landscape paintings were as much a scientific endeavour as they were an artistic one. In the 17th century or the 18th century, we didn't have satellites in the sky, we didn't have aerial photography, we didn't have ordnance survey or any of these things. And so these landscapes, in their intricate detail, were as much an effort to map the landscape, to map the country, as they were an effort to record it in a creative, artistic way. Hence the detail, and hence the figures for scale. Instead of a scale where we have, a centimetre per kilometre or something like that, we have a person. Because what can we all measure perfectly, if not ourselves? We perceive things in relation to ourselves. I know this watch is small because it's small in relation to me. I know this room is large because it's large in relation to me. And we know how vast this landscape is because we know roughly how big these people are, and we can identify with it. And so it's fascinating, I think, to see within one painting not just a very close identification with the artist's own city, not just an effort to accentuate those aspects of the city which allowed it to take on the appearance that it did, the city centre island, the river, the port coming in from the left-hand side, but also to emphasise and utilise the various different cultural influences that came from overseas, that are a result of exactly what we're seeing here: a successful harbour, a busy, bustling customs house, which is busy with ships unloading and offloading, or reloading and offloading. Something that's defined by, its ecclesiastical monuments, its churches, its town halls, and of course, its centres of overseas trade. So hopefully this kind of plays into the ideas that we were looking at in the previous lecture, where we were talking about romanticism. We were talking about a Cork artist who was using his experience of the landscape of the port in order to also explore these wider European themes. And of course we have something that's the very same here. 100 years later, we have the port of Cork, its maritime tradition, being explored and accentuated in a way which emphasises Cork's place within a much wider European context. So I hope that you've enjoyed this investigation of one of our most beloved artworks, and hopefully this gives you a sense of the history and of the culture that underpins our city centre here in Cork.